Christopher had always believed that after 37 years of marriage, he knew everything there was to know about his wife Caroline. They had weathered storms together, raised 3 children, and built what everyone considered to be one of the most solid marriages in their social circle. Their estate in the countryside of England had been their sanctuary, a place where they had created countless memories and shared intimate moments that seemed to bind them together forever. The grand Victorian mansion had been in Caroline's family for generations, its sprawling grounds and numerous rooms holding centuries of history within its walls. Christopher had fallen in love with both the house and Caroline when he first visited 40 years ago, and over the decades, he had come to know every corner, every creaking floorboard, every hidden alcove that the old building possessed. Or so he thought. It was a particularly dreary Tuesday morning in late October when Christopher first noticed something that would begin to unravel the very foundation of everything he believed about his marriage. Caroline had left earlier than usual for what she claimed was a charity meeting in the nearby village. She had been attending these meetings more frequently in recent months, sometimes staying away for entire afternoons or even returning home well past dinner time. When Christopher had asked about the nature of these charitable endeavors, Caroline had been vague, mentioning something about organizing fundraisers for local causes. The morning rain drummed steadily against the tall windows of the breakfast room as Christopher sat alone with his coffee and newspaper. The house felt unusually quiet without Caroline's presence, and he found himself unable to concentrate on the day's news. Something had been bothering him for weeks now, a nagging feeling that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Caroline had been different lately, more secretive, more distant. There were phone calls that she would take in private, whispered conversations that would cease the moment he entered a room, and a general air of preoccupation that seemed to surround her like an invisible barrier. As he finished his breakfast, Christopher decided to take a walk through the house. It was something he did occasionally when Caroline was away, not out of any sense of suspicion, but simply because he enjoyed the solitude and the opportunity to appreciate the beauty of their home without distraction. The mansion was filled with antiques, family portraits, and treasures that Caroline's family had collected over the years. Each room told a story, and Christopher had always found comfort in these familiar surroundings. He wandered through the main living areas, past the formal dining room with its mahogany table that could seat 20 guests, through the library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, and into the conservatory where Caroline tended to her prized orchids. Everything appeared normal, exactly as it should be, yet the feeling of unease continued to grow within him. It was as he was making his way up the grand staircase to the second floor that Christopher noticed something odd. Caroline had been coming down these very stairs the previous evening, and she had seemed startled to see him waiting at the bottom. She had quickly composed herself and kissed him goodnight, but there had been something in her expression, a fleeting look of guilt or perhaps fear, that had troubled him throughout the night. Now, in the clear light of day, Christopher tried to retrace Caroline's steps from the evening before. She had been upstairs for over an hour, claiming she needed to organize some old documents in her private study. But as Christopher reached the second-floor landing, he realized that Caroline's study was in the opposite direction from where she had been coming when he saw her on the stairs. The second floor of the mansion was laid out in a long corridor with rooms branching off on either side. Caroline's study was at the far end, overlooking the rose garden, while the direction she had been coming from led to what had once been the children's wing when their sons were younger. Those rooms had been largely unused for years, serving mainly as storage spaces for items that Caroline couldn't bear to part with but no longer needed in their daily lives. Christopher found himself walking toward the children's wing, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runner that stretched the length of the hallway. The first few rooms he passed were exactly as he remembered them, filled with dusty furniture covered in white sheets, boxes of Christmas decorations, and remnants of their children's younger years. But as he approached the room at the very end of the corridor, he noticed that the door was slightly ajar, which was unusual since Caroline was meticulous about keeping unused rooms properly closed. Pushing the door open, Christopher stepped into what had once been his youngest son's bedroom. The room had been transformed since he had last seen it, no longer serving as storage but appearing to be some kind of private retreat. The old furniture had been removed and replaced with a comfortable armchair, a small writing desk, and, surprisingly, a telephone line that Christopher was certain had not been there before. But what caught his attention most was a section of the wall that looked different from the rest. While the room was paneled in the same dark wood as the other bedrooms, There was an area near the corner that seemed to have slightly different spacing between the panels. Christopher approached the wall and ran his hands along the wood, feeling for any irregularities. His fingers detected what felt like a thin gap that ran vertically for about 6 feet, then turned at a right angle. The discovery was so unexpected that Christopher actually stepped back from the wall, his heart beginning to race. In all his years in this house, he had never noticed anything unusual about this particular room. Yet now, examining the wall more carefully, it became clear that what he was looking at was not a natural part of the room's construction, but rather some kind of concealed entrance. Christopher had read enough mystery novels and seen enough period dramas to know that old houses often contained hidden passages and secret rooms. The idea was not entirely foreign to him, but the possibility that such a thing existed in his own home, and that Caroline might know about it while he did not, was deeply unsettling. His hands trembling slightly, Christopher began to examine the wood paneling more systematically. He pressed against different sections, looking for any kind of mechanism that might reveal how the concealed entrance operated. It was when he pressed against a particular knot in the wood, located about 4 feet from the floor, that he heard a soft clicking sound. The section of wall that he had identified as different slowly swung inward, revealing itself to be a cleverly concealed door. Beyond the opening lay not another room, but a narrow staircase that led downward into darkness. The air that drifted up from below carried with it a scent that was both familiar and strange, a mixture of Caroline's favorite perfume and something else that Christopher couldn't immediately identify. Standing at the threshold of this hidden passage, Christopher felt his world beginning to shift in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The woman he had been married to for nearly 4 decades, the woman who shared his bed and his breakfast table, who had borne his children and stood by his side through every triumph and tragedy, had been keeping secrets. Not small secrets, not the kind of harmless omissions that every married couple practiced, but something significant enough to require its own hidden space within their shared home. The rational part of Christopher's mind urged him to close the door, to pretend he had never discovered it, and to wait for Caroline to return so he could ask her about it directly. But a larger part of him, the part that had been growing increasingly troubled by his wife's recent behavior, knew that he had to discover the truth for himself. If Caroline had been comfortable keeping this secret from him for what appeared to be a considerable length of time, there was no guarantee that she would be truthful if confronted. Christopher returned to the main part of the house and retrieved a flashlight from the utility room. His hands were shaking as he made his way back up the stairs and through the hidden door. The narrow staircase was steep and appeared to have been constructed long ago, probably when the house was originally built. Each step creaked softly under his weight as he descended into the unknown. The staircase led down for what Christopher estimated to be about 15 steps before opening into a small chamber. As his flashlight beam swept across the space, he realized that he was looking at what could only be described as a secret room, complete with its own lighting fixtures and ventilation system. Someone had taken considerable care to make this hidden space comfortable and functional. The room was larger than Christopher had expected, probably about 12 feet by 10 feet, with a low ceiling that required him to duck slightly as he moved around. Against one wall was a comfortable sofa with several throw pillows, and nearby was a small table holding what appeared to be a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. The sight of those 2 glasses sent a chill down Christopher's spine, confirming his growing suspicion that Caroline had not been using this room alone. But it was the contents of a wooden cabinet against the far wall that truly shattered Christopher's sense of reality. The cabinet was filled with photographs, letters, and personal items that told a story he was unprepared to hear. There were pictures of Caroline with a man Christopher didn't recognize, images that were clearly recent and showed an intimacy that went far beyond friendship. The man appeared to be roughly the same age as Caroline, with silver hair and kind eyes, and in every photograph, he was looking at Caroline with an expression of unmistakable love and devotion. The letters, written in Caroline's distinctive handwriting, were addressed to someone called "My Darling Michael," and contained expressions of love, longing, and detailed plans for future meetings. As Christopher read through them with trembling hands, he learned that Caroline had been involved in what could only be described as a passionate love affair for over 2 years. The letters spoke of stolen moments, secret rendezvous, and a deep emotional connection that Caroline described as unlike anything she had ever experienced. One letter in particular, dated just 3 weeks earlier, contained passages that made Christopher feel physically ill. Caroline had written about how difficult it was becoming to maintain the pretense of her marriage, how she longed to be free to spend every day with Michael, and how she had begun to fantasize about a life where they could be together openly. She wrote about the guilt she felt for deceiving Christopher, but also about how alive and truly herself she felt when she was with Michael. The discovery of this secret room and its contents represented more than just the revelation of an affair. It was evidence of an elaborate deception that had been carried out with careful planning and deliberate intent. Caroline had not simply fallen into temptation and made a mistake. She had constructed an entire secret life, complete with its own physical space and emotional landscape, all while continuing to share a home and a bed with Christopher. As he sat in the hidden room, surrounded by evidence of his wife's betrayal, Christopher felt the foundations of his entire adult life crumbling around him. Everything he had believed about his marriage, about Caroline, about the life they had built together, was revealed to be built upon a lie. The woman he had trusted completely, the partner he had shared his deepest secrets and fears with, had been living a double life with a skill and dedication that was almost professional in its execution. The practical questions began to flood his mind even as he struggled to process the emotional impact of his discovery. How long had Caroline been planning this deception? How had she managed to construct this secret room without his knowledge? Who was Michael? And how had Caroline met him? Were there other people who knew about the affair, friends, and family members who had been complicit in helping Caroline maintain her deception? But perhaps the most painful question of all was whether Caroline had ever truly loved him, or if their entire marriage had been nothing more than a convenient arrangement that she had endured while waiting for something better to come along. The passionate language she used in her letters to Michael suggested a depth of feeling that Christopher realized he had never seen directed toward himself, even in the early days of their courtship. As the afternoon light began to fade, Christopher finally forced himself to leave the secret room and return to the upper floors of the house. He carefully closed the hidden door and tried to arrange the room exactly as he had found it, though he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The knowledge he now possessed felt like a heavy weight in his chest, making it difficult to breathe and impossible to think about anything else. Christopher spent the remainder of the day in his own study, staring out the window at the grounds he had loved for so many years, trying to decide what to do with his devastating discovery. Should he confront Caroline immediately when she returned home? Should he seek legal advice? Should he hire a private investigator to learn more about Michael and the extent of Caroline's deception? As evening approached, and he heard Caroline's car in the driveway, Christopher realized that he was not ready for any kind of confrontation. He needed time to process what he had learned, time to decide how to proceed, and, most importantly, time to observe Caroline's behavior with his newfound knowledge. He had been blind to her deception for over 2 years. Perhaps now that his eyes were open, he would be able to see other signs of her betrayal that he had previously missed. When Caroline entered the house, calling out her usual cheerful greeting, Christopher forced himself to respond normally. She appeared in his study doorway, looking exactly as she had that morning, and asked about his day with the same casual interest she had shown for decades. The normalcy of the interaction, given what Christopher now knew, felt surreal and deeply disturbing. As they shared dinner and discussed mundane topics like the weather and their plans for the upcoming weekend, Christopher found himself studying Caroline's face for any signs of guilt or deception. She seemed completely at ease, discussing her charity work with enthusiasm and asking Christopher about his own activities with apparent genuine interest. The skill with which she maintained this facade was almost as shocking as the affair itself. That night, as Christopher lay in bed beside his wife of 37 years, listening to her peaceful breathing and feeling the familiar warmth of her body next to his, he understood that his life had been fundamentally altered. The trust that had been the foundation of their relationship was gone, shattered beyond any possibility of repair. Even if Caroline were to end her affair and beg for forgiveness, Christopher knew that he would never again be able to look at her without remembering the secret room and the passionate letters to another man. The discovery had opened a door that could never be closed, revealing a truth that would change everything that came after. As he stared into the darkness, Christopher began to understand that he was facing not just the end of his marriage, but the end of the life he had thought he was living. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and impossible decisions, but tonight he would lie beside the woman who had betrayed him and try to come to terms with the fact that the person he had loved most in the world was, in many ways, a complete stranger. The following days passed in a strange haze of normalcy and internal turmoil for Christopher. He found himself moving through his daily routines like an actor playing a familiar role, responding to Caroline's conversations and maintaining their usual patterns of interaction while his mind remained consumed with the knowledge of her secret life. Every smile she gave him felt like a knife twist, every casual touch a reminder of the intimacy she was sharing with another man. Christopher had always prided himself on being a straightforward person, someone who dealt with problems head-on rather than avoiding them. But the magnitude of Caroline's deception left him feeling paralyzed and uncertain about how to proceed. Part of him wanted to rage and demand explanations, while another part wanted to pretend he had never discovered the secret room at all. The rational portion of his mind insisted that he needed more information before taking any action, and it was this voice that ultimately prevailed. On Thursday morning, Caroline announced that she would be spending the entire day at another charity function, this one in a town nearly an hour away. She mentioned that she might be quite late returning, as the organizers had planned an evening reception following the afternoon meetings. As she gathered her things and kissed Christopher goodbye, he noticed that she seemed particularly excited about the day's activities, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm that he now understood had nothing to do with charitable work. After Caroline's car disappeared down the long driveway, Christopher waited 30 minutes to ensure she was truly gone before returning to the secret room. This time, he came prepared with a notepad and pen, determined to gather as much information as possible about the scope of Caroline's deception. The hidden chamber felt different in the morning light that filtered down through what he now realized was a cleverly concealed skylight, less mysterious but somehow more real, and therefore more devastating. Christopher began his investigation by examining the letters more systematically. The earliest one he could find was dated nearly 3 years ago, which meant that Caroline had been involved with Michael for even longer than he had initially thought. The progression of the relationship was clear from the correspondence, beginning with tentative expressions of attraction and gradually developing into declarations of passionate love and detailed discussions of future plans. What struck Christopher most forcefully as he read through the letters was the depth of emotional intimacy they revealed. Caroline wrote to Michael about her fears, her dreams, her disappointments, and her hopes with a vulnerability and openness that she had never shown to Christopher, even in their earliest days together. She described feeling understood and truly seen in a way that she claimed she had never experienced before, and she wrote about Michael as if he were not just a lover, but a soulmate who completed her in ways that Christopher apparently never had. The practical details revealed in the letters were equally troubling. Caroline and Michael had been meeting regularly at various hotels in nearby towns, sometimes for brief afternoon encounters, and occasionally for entire weekends when Caroline would tell Christopher she was visiting her sister in Scotland. They had established an elaborate system of communication that included a private post office box and a separate mobile phone that Caroline kept hidden in the secret room. Christopher discovered this phone in a small drawer beneath the writing table, and when he turned it on, he found hundreds of text messages between Caroline and Michael. The most recent messages, sent just the day before, revealed that today's supposed charity meeting was actually a romantic getaway to a countryside and where they had apparently spent several previous weekends. The messages were filled with anticipation and expressions of love that made Christopher feel sick to his stomach. But it was a handwritten journal that Christopher found hidden behind the wine bottles that truly shattered what remained of his emotional equilibrium. The journal contained Caroline's private thoughts about her marriage, her affair, and her plans for the future, written with the brutal honesty of someone who never expected the words to be read by anyone else. In entry after entry, Caroline wrote about how trapped and suffocated she felt in her marriage to Christopher. She described their relationship as comfortable but passionless, built on habit and convenience rather than genuine love or desire. She wrote about feeling invisible to Christopher, taken for granted, and unappreciated despite her efforts to maintain their household and social life. Most painfully, she described their physical relationship as mechanical and unfulfilling, something she endured rather than enjoyed. The contrast between Caroline's descriptions of her marriage and her affair was stark and devastating. With Michael, she wrote, she felt alive, desired, and valued. She described their physical relationship in terms that made Christopher realize that he had never truly satisfied his wife sexually, despite believing that they had a normal and healthy intimate life. She wrote about feelings of passion and desire that she claimed she had never experienced with Christopher, even in the beginning of their relationship. The most recent journal entries revealed that Caroline was seriously considering ending her marriage. She had begun researching divorce lawyers and had even calculated what her financial situation would be if she left Christopher and moved in with Michael. She wrote about the guilt she felt for deceiving Christopher, but also about her growing resentment toward him for what she perceived as his emotional unavailability and lack of genuine interest in her as a person. One particularly devastating entry, written just 2 weeks earlier, contained Caroline's reflections on a dinner party they had hosted for their friends. She wrote about watching Christopher hold court at the head of the table, telling his usual stories and basking in the attention of their guests, while she felt completely invisible beside him. She described feeling like nothing more than a prop in Christopher's life, a beautiful accessory who managed his household and accompanied him to social events, but who had no real voice or agency of her own. Reading these words, Christopher was forced to confront the possibility that Caroline's affair was not simply a matter of sexual temptation or momentary weakness, but rather the result of deep-seated problems in their marriage that he had been completely unaware of. The woman he thought he knew and understood appeared to have been desperately unhappy for years, feeling unloved and unappreciated in ways that he had never recognized or addressed. The discovery of Caroline's true feelings about their marriage forced Christopher to examine his own behavior and assumptions with painful honesty. Had he really been as inattentive and self-absorbed as Caroline's journal suggested? Had he failed to see his wife's unhappiness because he was too focused on his own needs and interests? The questions tortured him as he sat in the secret room, surrounded by evidence of how completely he had misunderstood the woman he had shared his life with for nearly 4 decades. Christopher spent the entire morning in the hidden chamber, reading and rereading the letters and journal entries until he felt emotionally drained and physically sick. The image he had always held of Caroline as a devoted wife and loving partner had been completely destroyed, replaced by the picture of a woman who had been living a lie for years while desperately seeking the love and passion she felt was missing from her marriage. When he finally forced himself to leave the secret room and return to the main house, Christopher felt like a different person from the man who had entered it just hours before. The comfortable familiarity of his surroundings now felt oppressive and false, every room holding memories that he now understood had been one-sided experiences. The photographs of him and Caroline that lined the mantelpiece, capturing decades of anniversaries, vacations, and family celebrations, now seemed like elaborate props in a performance that only he had believed was real. The afternoon stretched endlessly as Christopher wandered through the empty house, trying to process the full implications of what he had learned. The practical questions were overwhelming enough. How long had Caroline been planning to leave him? Was she simply waiting for the right moment to demand a divorce? Or was she hoping that Christopher would somehow discover her affair and in the marriage himself? Did their children know anything about their mother's secret life? And if so, how long had they been keeping Caroline's secrets? But the emotional impact was even more devastating than the practical concerns. Christopher found himself questioning not just his marriage, but his entire sense of himself as a husband and a man. If he had been so completely blind to his wife's unhappiness and needs, what did that say about his capacity for intimacy and understanding? Had he failed Caroline in fundamental ways that he was still unable to recognize, even with the evidence of her dissatisfaction laid out before him in black and white? As evening approached, and Christopher knew that Caroline would soon return home, he struggled with the question of how to face her. Could he continue to maintain the pretense of normalcy, knowing what he now knew about her true feelings and secret life? Or would his newfound knowledge be written all over his face, making it impossible to hide his discovery? The sound of Caroline's car in the driveway sent a jolt of anxiety through Christopher's entire body. He positioned himself in his study, pretending to read a book, and tried to prepare for the performance he would need to give. When Caroline entered the house, calling out her usual greeting, her voice sounded different to Christopher's ears, tinged with what he now recognized as the false cheerfulness of someone who was hiding something significant. Caroline appeared in his study doorway, looking flushed and happy in a way that Christopher now understood had nothing to do with charitable activities. Her hair was slightly mussed despite her obvious attempts to smooth it, and there was a glow about her that spoke of recent physical intimacy with someone who was not her husband. The sight of her made Christopher feel nauseated, but he forced himself to smile and ask about her day. Caroline's account of her supposed charity meeting was elaborate and detailed, filled with names of people Christopher had never heard of and descriptions of activities that sounded plausible, but which he now knew were complete fabrications. She spoke with the practiced ease of someone who had been lying regularly for years, never hesitating or contradicting herself, maintaining eye contact and seeming genuinely interested in sharing her experiences with him. The skill with which Caroline maintained her deception was almost as shocking as the affair itself. This was not the behavior of someone who was lying reluctantly or feeling guilty about her actions. This was the performance of someone who had become comfortable with living a double life, and who showed no signs of remorse or internal conflict about her ongoing betrayal. As they shared dinner together, Christopher found himself studying Caroline's face and mannerisms with new eyes. He noticed things that he had previously overlooked: the way she checked her phone frequently throughout the meal, the distant look that would occasionally cross her face when she thought he wasn't watching, the careful way she answered his questions about her activities and whereabouts. All of these small behaviors now took on new significance as signs of her secret life. The most disturbing realization was how natural and effortless Caroline's deception appeared to be. She was not struggling with guilt or fighting to maintain her lies. She seemed genuinely at ease with the double life she was leading. This suggested that either Caroline was a far more accomplished actress than Christopher had ever realized, or that she had become so disconnected from their marriage emotionally that lying to him no longer caused her any real distress. That night, as they prepared for bed together, Christopher was struck by the surreal nature of their domestic routine. Caroline moved through her familiar rituals of removing her makeup and brushing her teeth, chattering about plans for the upcoming weekend, and asking Christopher about his preferences for their Saturday evening dinner. The normalcy of the interaction felt like a cruel joke, given what Christopher now knew about how Caroline really spent her time and where her true affections lay. Lying in bed beside Caroline, listening to her breathing settle into the rhythms of sleep, Christopher found himself wondering how many other nights she had lain beside him while thinking about Michael. How many times had she made love to Christopher while wishing she was with someone else? How many conversations had they shared where Caroline was simply going through the motions, her heart and mind elsewhere? The questions tormented Christopher throughout the sleepless night, each one opening up new avenues of doubt and pain. By morning, he understood that his discovery of Caroline's secret room had been only the beginning of a much larger and more devastating revelation. The woman he had been married to for 37 years was not just having an affair. She was living an entirely different life, one in which Christopher played the role of an unwanted obligation rather than a beloved partner. As dawn broke over the estate that had once represented the pinnacle of Christopher's happiness and success, he realized that he was facing not just the end of his marriage, but the complete dismantling of everything he had believed about love, trust, and the life he thought he had been living. The discovery of Caroline's secret room had opened a door that could never be closed, revealing truths that would change everything that came after. The weekend arrived with the same autumn beauty that had graced their estate for decades, but Christopher found himself unable to appreciate the golden leaves and crisp air that had always brought him such pleasure. Caroline had suggested they host their usual Saturday evening dinner party for their close friends, something they had been doing monthly for over 20 years. Under normal circumstances, Christopher would have looked forward to the evening, but now the prospect of entertaining while maintaining the facade of a happy marriage felt overwhelming and deeply hypocritical. Nevertheless, Christopher agreed to the dinner party, partly because he lacked the energy to create an excuse for canceling, and partly because he found himself curious about how Caroline would behave in front of their friends now that he knew the truth about her secret life. Would she be able to maintain her performance of the devoted wife, or would there be cracks in her facade that others might notice? As Caroline busied herself with preparations throughout Saturday, Christopher watched her with the intensity of a detective studying a suspect. She moved through their home with her usual efficiency, arranging flowers, polishing silver, and preparing the elaborate menu she was known for among their social circle. To any casual observer, she appeared to be exactly what she had always seemed, a gracious hostess preparing to welcome friends into her beautiful home. But Christopher now noticed details that had previously escaped his attention. Caroline had received 3 separate phone calls during the day, each of which she took in private, stepping into the conservatory or the utility room to speak in hushed tones. When Christopher had casually asked about the calls, she had dismissed them as conversations with the caterers and florist, but Her explanations felt rehearsed and overly detailed in the way that lies often do. He also observed that Caroline had taken unusual care with her appearance, choosing a dress that was more elegant and flattering than what she typically wore for their informal dinner parties. Her makeup was more carefully applied, her hair styled with particular attention, and she had chosen jewelry that Christopher had given her for their 25th wedding anniversary. The irony of seeing her wear his gifts while maintaining her affair created a bitter taste in his mouth that no amount of wine could wash away. Their guests arrived at 7 o'clock as planned. Margaret and David Thompson, who had been their closest friends for over 30 years, James and Elizabeth Hartwell, whom they had met through their children's school, and Patricia Hamilton, a widow who had become a regular addition to their gatherings since her husband's death 5 years earlier. These were people who knew Christopher and Caroline intimately, who had shared holidays and celebrations, who had supported them through difficult times and rejoiced in their successes. As Christopher greeted each couple at the door, he found himself wondering what they would think if they knew the truth about Caroline's secret life. Would they be shocked and sympathetic, or had Caroline been so skilled in her deceptions that she had managed to fool not just her husband but their entire social circle? The possibility that their closest friends might already know about Caroline's affair and had been keeping it from him was almost too painful to consider. The early part of the evening proceeded much as it always did. Caroline was the perfect hostess, ensuring that everyone's wine glasses remained full and guiding the conversation with the skill of someone who had been entertaining for decades. She asked thoughtful questions about their friends' children and grandchildren, remembered important details about their work and travel plans, and seemed genuinely interested in their responses. To Christopher's trained eye, however, there was something slightly forced about her performance, a brightness that seemed artificial and strained. It was during the main course that Christopher noticed something that made his blood run cold. Caroline was telling a story about a recent charity auction she claimed to have attended, providing elaborate details about the items for sale and the amounts they had raised. But, as she spoke, Christopher realized that he had read about this exact event in one of Caroline's letters to Michael. According to her own written account, she had been with Michael that afternoon, not at a charity auction at all. The event she was describing had taken place months earlier, and she was recycling the story to create an alibi for her recent activities. The realization that Caroline was lying so smoothly and confidently to their closest friends, people who had been part of their lives for decades, was deeply disturbing. It suggested that her capacity for deception went far beyond what was necessary to maintain her affair. She was lying reflexively, casually, in situations where the truth would have been just as acceptable as fiction. This spoke to a fundamental dishonesty that seemed to have infected every aspect of her personality. Christopher found himself studying their friends' faces as Caroline spoke, looking for any signs that they might be aware of her deception. But Margaret, David, James, Elizabeth, and Patricia all listened with the same interested attention they had always shown to Caroline's stories, occasionally asking questions or making supportive comments. If any of them suspected that Caroline was lying, they showed no outward signs of it. As the evening progressed, Christopher became increasingly aware of the surreal nature of the situation. Here they all were, 6 people who had known each other for decades, sharing an intimate dinner in the home where Christopher and Caroline had created so many memories. And yet the entire evening was built on a foundation of lies and deception. Caroline was performing the role of loving wife and gracious hostess while maintaining a secret relationship that would destroy the very friendships she was celebrating. The conversation eventually turned to upcoming holiday plans, as it often did during their autumn gatherings. Margaret mentioned that she and David were planning a trip to Italy in the spring, and Caroline immediately expressed enthusiasm about the idea, suggesting that she and Christopher might consider joining them. The casual way she discussed future plans with Christopher, knowing what he now knew about her real intentions, felt like a particularly cruel form of torture. Christopher forced himself to participate in the conversation, making appropriate responses and maintaining his usual demeanor, but he felt like he was watching the entire scene from outside his own body. The man his friends were talking to, the husband who was making plans for future trips and discussing home improvements, was a fiction. The real Christopher was consumed with rage, betrayal, and a growing sense that his entire adult life had been built on an illusion. It was Elizabeth Hartwell who inadvertently provided Christopher with the most devastating revelation of the evening. During a discussion about mutual acquaintances, She mentioned running into Caroline at a restaurant in the nearby market town the previous week. According to Elizabeth, Caroline had been having lunch with a distinguished-looking gentleman whom Elizabeth didn't recognize, and they had appeared to be deep in intimate conversation. Caroline's response to this observation was masterful in its casualness. She laughed and explained that she had been meeting with a potential new client for her interior design consulting work, a service she provided occasionally for wealthy families in the area. She described the man as the owner of a large estate who was looking for help redecorating his late wife's sitting room, and she provided enough specific details to make the story seem completely plausible. But Christopher knew from the letters that Caroline had been with Michael that day, and he realized that Elizabeth had inadvertently witnessed one of their secret meetings. The fact that Caroline could fabricate such an elaborate and convincing explanation on the spot, without any apparent nervousness or hesitation, demonstrated a level of skill and deception that was truly chilling. As the evening wore on, Christopher found himself becoming increasingly angry, not just at Caroline but at their friends for their unwitting participation in her charade. He wanted to stand up and tell them the truth, to expose Caroline's lies and force everyone to confront the reality of what was happening. But he also understood that such an action would devastate not just Caroline but all of their friends, who would be forced to choose sides and navigate the wreckage of a social circle that had been stable for decades. The dinner party finally ended near midnight, with the usual exchanges of kisses and promises to get together again soon. Christopher watched Caroline bid farewell to each of their friends, hugging them warmly and thanking them for their company, all while knowing that she was planning to abandon not just her marriage but the entire social world they had built together. The performance was so convincing that Christopher almost doubted his own knowledge of the truth. After their guests had departed and Caroline had begun clearing the dinner dishes, Christopher excused himself and retreated to his study. He could hear Caroline moving about the house, humming softly as she completed her hostess duties, and the normalcy of the domestic sounds felt like another layer of deception. How many times had he listened to these same sounds over the years, feeling contentment and gratitude for the life they had built together, never realizing that Caroline was simply going through the motions while her heart and mind were elsewhere. The next morning brought fresh evidence of Caroline's duplicity. Christopher discovered a text message on the phone she had left charging in the kitchen, apparently forgetting that the screen would display incoming messages. The text was from someone identified simply as M and read, "Missing you already. Can't wait for Tuesday." The casual intimacy of the message and the fact that Caroline was making plans for another meeting just hours after hosting their friends in their shared home was deeply disturbing. When Caroline came down for breakfast, Christopher handed her the phone without comment, watching her face carefully for any signs of guilt or discomfort. But Caroline simply glanced at the screen, deleted the message with a quick swipe, and began discussing their plans for the day as if nothing had happened. Her complete lack of reaction suggested that she had become so comfortable with her deception that even close calls no longer caused her any significant anxiety. The ease with which Caroline maintained her lies, even in the face of potential discovery, forced Christopher to confront the possibility that he had never really known his wife at all. The woman he had been married to for 37 years was capable of levels of deception and manipulation that he had never suspected, and she showed no signs of guilt or remorse about the pain her actions would inevitably cause. As Sunday afternoon approached, Caroline announced that she needed to visit her sister Margaret in the next county, claiming that Margaret was feeling unwell and could use some company. She packed an overnight bag and kissed Christopher goodbye with the same casual affection she had shown for decades, promising to call that evening to let him know how Margaret was feeling. But Christopher had found Margaret's phone number in Caroline's address book, and after Caroline's car disappeared down the driveway, he placed a call that confirmed his suspicions. Margaret was perfectly well and had no idea that Caroline was planning to visit. In fact, Margaret mentioned that she hadn't spoken to Caroline in over a month, which contradicted Caroline's regular claims about staying in close touch with her sister. The realization that Caroline's sister visits, which had been happening monthly for over 2 years, were actually meetings with Michael was devastating. Christopher calculated that Caroline had spent dozens of weekends with her lover while claiming to be caring for a family member, and the systematic nature of this particular deception spoke to a level of planning and forethought that was truly chilling. As Christopher sat alone in the house that had once been his sanctuary, he understood that his discovery of Caroline's secret room had been only the beginning of a much larger revelation. His wife was not simply having an affair. She was living an entirely fabricated life, one in which every story, every explanation, every expression of affection was carefully calculated to maintain her freedom to pursue her real desires, while keeping Christopher as an unwitting accomplice to his own betrayal. The weekend had shown Christopher that Caroline was not struggling with guilt about her actions or fighting to maintain her deceptions. She was comfortable with her double life, skilled in her lies, and, apparently, without remorse for the pain she was causing. The woman he had loved and trusted for nearly 4 decades was a stranger, and the life he thought they had built together was nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to give Caroline the security and social status she desired while pursuing her true happiness elsewhere. As evening fell, and Christopher prepared to spend another night alone, he realized that he could no longer continue living in ignorance. The knowledge of Caroline's betrayal had fundamentally changed him, and there was no going back to the comfortable blindness he had enjoyed just days earlier. Whatever came next, whether confrontation, separation, or divorce, Christopher knew that his old life was over and that he would have to find a way to build something new from the wreckage of everything he had once believed to be true. Monday morning brought with it a clarity that Christopher had not experienced since discovering Caroline's secret room. The weekend's revelations, particularly watching Caroline lie so effortlessly to their closest friends and then disappear for another romantic rendezvous with Michael, had crystallized his understanding of the situation. He could no longer continue living in this state of knowledge without action, pretending ignorance, while watching his wife perform the role of devoted spouse. Christopher had spent much of Sunday night making a decision that he knew would change everything. He was going to hire a private investigator to gather concrete evidence of Caroline's affair, not because he doubted what he had already discovered, but because he understood that if their marriage was going to end, he needed to be prepared for the legal and financial battles that would inevitably follow. After 37 years of marriage and the considerable wealth they had accumulated together, divorce would be a complex and potentially contentious process. Early Monday morning, while Caroline was still away on her fabricated visit to her sister, Christopher drove to the city and met with a highly recommended private investigation firm. The meeting was one of the most difficult conversations of Christopher's life, as he was forced to articulate out loud the extent of his wife's betrayal and deception. But the investigator, a professional woman named Sarah Mitchell, handled the situation with discretion and expertise that made Christopher feel he had made the right choice. Sarah explained that adultery cases were unfortunately common in her line of work, and she outlined the type of evidence that would be most useful if Christopher decided to pursue a divorce. She would conduct surveillance of Caroline's activities, particularly during her supposed charity meetings and sister visits, and would gather photographic and documentary evidence of her relationship with Michael. The process would take several weeks to complete thoroughly, but Sarah was confident that they would be able to build a comprehensive case. Christopher returned home that afternoon feeling both relieved and apprehensive. Taking concrete action had given him a sense of purpose and control that had been missing since his discovery of the secret room. But he also understood that he was setting in motion events that could not be undone. Once he had professional evidence of Caroline's affair, he would have to decide how to use that information, and all of the options would result in the destruction of the life they had built together. Caroline returned home that evening in high spirits, full of stories about her supposed visit with her sister. She described Margaret's imaginary illness in detail, complete with symptoms and treatments, and expressed concern about her sister's health with what appeared to be genuine emotion. The performance was so convincing that Christopher found himself wondering how many other elaborate lies Caroline had told over the years that he had never questioned. As they shared dinner together, Christopher studied Caroline's face and mannerisms with the intensity of someone who was seeing her for the last time. In a sense, that was exactly what was happening. Regardless of what actions he ultimately decided to take, his relationship with Caroline as he had known it was over. The woman sitting across from him at their dining room table was no longer his wife in any meaningful sense. She was an adversary who had been waging a secret war against their marriage while he remained completely unaware of the battle. The most disturbing aspect of Caroline's behavior was how natural and unstudied it appeared to be. She was not struggling to maintain her deceptions or showing signs of guilt about her actions. Her lies came as easily as breathing, and she seemed genuinely at ease with the double life she was leading. This suggested that Caroline's capacity for deception was not a recent development, but rather a fundamental aspect of her personality that Christopher had somehow failed to recognize in nearly 4 decades of marriage. Over the next 2 weeks, Christopher maintained the pretense of normalcy while Sarah Mitchell conducted her investigation. The process was torturous, as Christopher was forced to continue his daily routines and interactions with Caroline while knowing that professional investigators were documenting her every meeting with Michael. Each morning, he kissed his wife goodbye and wished her well on her various activities, all while knowing that those activities were being photographed and recorded for eventual use in divorce proceedings. The strain of maintaining this facade began to take its toll on Christopher's physical and emotional health. He found himself unable to sleep through the night, his appetite diminished, and he struggled to concentrate on his work and social obligations. Friends began to comment on his appearance, noting that he seemed tired and distracted, but Christopher deflected their concerns with vague explanations about business stress and minor health issues. Caroline, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving. Her mood was consistently upbeat, her energy level high, and she appeared to be enjoying her life more than Christopher had seen in years. The irony was not lost on him that his wife's happiness was directly proportional to the amount of time she was spending away from their marriage and with her lover. The passionate, vivacious woman he was seeing was the real Caroline, and she was saving her best self for someone who was not her husband. It was during the 3rd week of the investigation that Christopher received a call from Sarah Mitchell that changed everything. The investigator had been following Caroline to what was supposed to be another charity meeting when she made a discovery that went far beyond documenting a simple affair. Caroline and Michael were not just lovers. They were actively planning a future together that involved much more than Christopher had imagined. According to Sarah's report, Caroline and Michael had spent the afternoon at a real estate office, looking at properties in France. They had toured a beautiful villa in Provence that was for sale, and Caroline had been photographed signing what appeared to be preliminary purchase documents. The investigator had also obtained copies of bank records showing that Caroline had been secretly transferring large sums of money from their joint accounts to a private account that Christopher knew nothing about. The revelation that Caroline was not just having an affair, but was actively planning to leave the country with Michael while systematically stealing from their shared assets was devastating. Christopher had expected to discover evidence of adultery, but he had not prepared himself for evidence of what amounted to financial fraud and conspiracy to disappear with a significant portion of their wealth. Sarah's investigation had also revealed Michael's true identity and background. He was not the innocent romantic figure that Christopher had imagined, but rather a man with a history of relationships with wealthy married women. Michael Thornton was a former financial advisor who had lost his license after being accused of improperly managing client assets. His relationship with Caroline appeared to follow a pattern he had established with at least 2 other women, both of whom had divorced their husbands and relocated to France before their relationships with Michael ended acrimoniously. The discovery that Caroline was involved with a man who appeared to be a professional predator who targeted wealthy married women added a new dimension of humiliation and anger to Christopher's emotional state. His wife was not just betraying him for love. She was being manipulated by someone who had identified her as a mark and was systematically working to separate her from her marriage and her money. Armed with this new information, Christopher found himself facing an impossible choice. Should he confront Caroline immediately and try to save her from what appeared to be an elaborate con game, or should he allow the investigation to continue and gather enough evidence to protect himself in the inevitable divorce proceedings? His lawyer had advised him to remain silent and continue gathering evidence, but Christopher found it increasingly difficult to watch his wife walk deeper into what appeared to be a carefully laid trap. The decision was made for him when Caroline announced that she would be taking a 2-week trip to France to help organize a major charity fundraiser. She provided elaborate details about the event, complete with names of organizers and descriptions of activities, but Christopher now recognized this as another fabrication designed to cover her real activities. According to Sarah's intelligence, Caroline and Michael were planning to finalize the purchase of the French villa and establish residence there as the first step in their plan to begin a new life together. Christopher realized that if he allowed Caroline to leave for France, there was a real possibility that she might not return. The money she had already transferred could be used to purchase the property outright, and once she was established in France, it would be much more difficult to pursue any legal action against her or recover the assets she had stolen. The time for passive observation had ended. He needed to take decisive action to protect himself and his interests. That evening, as Caroline busied herself with packing for her supposed charity trip, Christopher made his decision. He would confront her in the morning before she had a chance to leave for the airport. He would present her with the evidence of her affair and her financial deceptions, and he would demand that she choose between ending her relationship with Michael immediately or facing immediate divorce proceedings with the full weight of the evidence he had gathered. Christopher spent the night in his study, reviewing the investigators' reports and photographs, preparing himself for the confrontation that would either save his marriage or end it forever. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Hundreds of photographs of Caroline and Michael together in various hotels and restaurants, bank records showing the unauthorized transfers, copies of the French real estate documents, and detailed reports of their activities over the past several weeks. But, as Christopher looked through the evidence, he found himself wondering if saving the marriage was even what he truly wanted anymore. The woman revealed in these photographs and documents was not the person he had thought he married. Caroline's capacity for deception, her willingness to steal from their joint assets, and her involvement with a man who appeared to be a predatory con artist suggested fundamental character flaws that went far beyond simple marital dissatisfaction. The Caroline he had loved for 37 years had been, in many ways, a fiction. The real Caroline was someone who could lie with perfect ease, steal from her husband without apparent remorse, and plan the destruction of their life together while maintaining the facade of a loving wife. Even if she were to end her affair and beg for forgiveness, Christopher was not certain that he could ever trust her again or rebuild a relationship with someone capable of such systematic and calculating betrayal. As dawn approached, and Christopher heard Caroline stirring upstairs, he understood that the next few hours would determine the rest of his life. The confrontation he was about to initiate would either begin a process of healing and rebuilding, or it would mark the official end of a marriage that had actually died years earlier when Caroline had chosen to seek love and satisfaction in the arms of another man. Christopher straightened his tie, gathered the evidence files, and prepared to face his wife with the truth about what he knew and what he had discovered. After weeks of living with the knowledge of her betrayal while maintaining the pretense of ignorance, he was finally ready to force Caroline to confront the consequences of her choices and to begin the process of rebuilding his own life, whatever form that rebuilding might take. The man who climbed the stairs to face his wife was fundamentally different from the man who had discovered the secret room just 3 weeks earlier. Christopher had been forced to confront not just his wife's capacity for deception, but his own naivety and blindness to the reality of their relationship. The comfortable illusions that had sustained him for decades were gone, replaced by a harder but more honest understanding of love, trust, and the complex dynamics of long-term relationships. Christopher found Caroline in their bedroom, methodically packing her suitcase for what she claimed would be a 2-week charity mission to France. She was humming softly as she folded her most elegant clothes, including several outfits that Christopher had never seen her wear during their actual charitable endeavors. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so utterly normal, that for a moment Christopher almost doubted the reality of everything he had discovered. But the weight of the evidence folder in his hands and the presence of his lawyer, whom he had asked to wait in the study, reminded him that this peaceful morning tableau was about to be shattered forever. Caroline looked up as Christopher entered the room, and her face lit up with the warm smile that had once been able to dissolve any tension between them. She was genuinely beautiful, even at 62, and seeing her now, glowing with the anticipation of her planned escape with Michael, Christopher was struck by how much younger and more vibrant she appeared than she had in years. The realization that his wife had been withholding this version of herself from their marriage, saving her passion and joy for another man, created a fresh wave of pain that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. "Good morning, darling," Caroline said, moving toward him for their customary morning kiss. "I'm nearly finished packing. The car service should be here within the hour to take me to the airport. I do hope this fundraiser goes well. The organizers are hoping to raise enough money to fund 3 new schools in rural province." Christopher stepped back, avoiding her embrace, and Caroline's expression shifted to one of mild confusion. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Christopher could see his wife's mind working, trying to assess whether his unusual behavior was significant or simply the result of his well-known dislike of early morning departures. "Caroline," Christopher said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning within him, "we need to talk. I've asked Thomas Whitfield to join us. He's waiting in my study." The mention of their family lawyer caused an immediate and dramatic change in Caroline's demeanor. The warm smile vanished, replaced by a look of sharp alertness that Christopher had never seen before. It was the expression of someone who had been caught off guard but was rapidly calculating how to respond to an unexpected threat. "Thomas, why on earth would our lawyer need to be here at 7 o'clock in the morning?" Caroline asked, her tone carefully controlled but with an edge that betrayed her growing anxiety. "Christopher, what's going on? You're acting very strangely." Christopher held up the evidence folder, watching as Caroline's eyes fixed on it with unmistakable recognition and fear. In that moment, he saw the facade of the loving wife completely disappear, replaced by the cold calculation of someone who realized that their carefully constructed deceptions were about to be exposed. "I know about Michael," Christopher said simply. "I know about the secret room, the affair, the money you've been stealing from our accounts, and the house you're planning to buy in France. I know about everything, Caroline." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Caroline's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to denial to anger, before settling into a mask of defiant composure that Christopher had never seen before. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely different from the warm, familiar tone he had heard just moments earlier. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're clearly mistaken about something," Caroline said. But her words lacked conviction, and she made no move to approach Christopher or examine the evidence he was holding. "Perhaps we should discuss this after I return from France. This is hardly the time for whatever paranoid fantasy you've constructed." Christopher opened the folder and withdrew a photograph of Caroline and Michael embracing passionately outside a hotel in the nearby market town. He held it up so that Caroline could see it clearly, watching as the last vestiges of her pretense crumbled away. "This was taken last Tuesday," Christopher said. "The same day you told me you were attending a charity luncheon with Margaret Thompson. Shall I show you the photographs from your supposed visit to your sister last weekend? Or perhaps you'd prefer to see the bank records showing the £150,000 you've transferred to an account I've never heard of." Caroline's response was not what Christopher had expected. Instead of breaking down or attempting to explain herself, she straightened her shoulders and looked directly into his eyes with a defiance that was both impressive and chilling. "Fine," she said, her voice now cold and controlled. "Yes, I'm having an affair. Yes, I've been planning to leave you. And yes, I've taken money that I consider to be rightfully mine after 37 years of marriage to a man who has never truly seen me or appreciated what I've sacrificed for this family." The bluntness of her confession was more shocking than Christopher had anticipated. He had prepared for denials, lies, perhaps even tears, and pleas for forgiveness. But Caroline's immediate transition to angry justification caught him off guard and revealed a level of resentment that went far deeper than anything he had imagined. "Michael loves me in a way that you never have," Caroline continued, her voice growing stronger and more passionate. "He sees me as a woman, not just as an accessory to your life or a manager for your household. For the first time in decades, I feel alive, desired, and valued for who I really am rather than what I can provide for someone else." Christopher found his voice and asked the question that had been torturing him since his discovery of her journal. "How long have you been unhappy, Caroline? How long have you been planning this deception?" Caroline's laugh was bitter and devoid of any warmth. "Unhappy? Christopher, I've been dying slowly in this marriage for 20 years. You stopped seeing me as anything more than a beautiful ornament when the children left home. You've been so absorbed in your business, your hobbies, your social position that you haven't noticed that your wife has been disappearing right in front of your eyes." "But you never said anything," Christopher protested. "You never told me you were unhappy. We could have worked on our problems, gone to counseling, found a way to reconnect." "I tried," Caroline said, her voice rising with years of suppressed frustration. "I tried for years to get your attention, to make you notice that I was more than just someone who organized your dinner parties and managed your social calendar. But you were always too busy, too important, too focused on everything except the woman who was supposed to be your partner in life." Christopher felt a surge of anger at what he perceived as Caroline's rewriting of their history. "That's not true, and you know it. I've always loved you, always been faithful, always provided for you and our family. I may not be perfect, but I've been a good husband. A good provider, perhaps, Caroline replied sharply. But not a good husband. A good husband would have noticed that his wife was desperately lonely. A good husband would have seen that the woman he married was withering away from lack of attention and genuine affection. You've been faithful to me in the same way you've been faithful to your investment portfolio, Christopher. I've been a possession, not a person. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the bedroom door. Thomas Whitfield, their lawyer, appeared in the doorway with the uncomfortable expression of someone who wished he was anywhere else. I apologize for interrupting, Thomas said carefully, but given what I've been told about the situation, I think it would be advisable for us to discuss the legal implications of these revelations before any decisions are made that cannot be undone. Caroline turned to Thomas with the same cold composure she had shown Christopher. There's nothing to discuss, Thomas. I'm leaving Christopher, I'm leaving England, and I'm starting a new life with someone who actually values me. Your client can pursue whatever legal remedies he thinks are appropriate. Caroline, Thomas said gently, the evidence suggests that you've engaged in activities that could be considered fraud and theft. If you leave the country now, particularly with assets that may not be legally yours to take, you could be exposing yourself to serious criminal charges, not just civil litigation. For the first time since the confrontation began, Caroline's confidence seemed to waver. What do you mean, criminal charges? Christopher stepped forward, his own anger now matching Caroline's intensity. I mean that you've stolen a substantial amount of money from our joint accounts without authorization, and you've been planning to leave the country with those assets. That's not just adultery, Caroline. That's fraud, and it's a crime. Caroline's face went pale as the implications of her actions became clear. The money I took. I earned that money through 37 years of marriage. I sacrificed my career, my independence, my youth for this family. That money represents what I'm owed. That's not how the law works, Thomas explained. Marital assets are subject to specific legal procedures for division. What you've done appears to be unauthorized removal of substantial funds with intent to deprive your spouse of his rightful share. Combined with your plans to leave the country, it could be construed as theft with intent to flee prosecution. Christopher watched as Caroline processed this information, seeing her carefully laid plans beginning to crumble before her eyes. The confident, defiant woman who had stood up to him just minutes earlier was beginning to understand that her escape with Michael might not be as simple as she had imagined. What about Michael? Caroline asked, her voice now smaller and more uncertain. What role does he play in this? Christopher felt a grim satisfaction as he delivered the information that would destroy Caroline's remaining illusions about her lover. Michael Thornton is a con artist, Caroline. He's done this before, at least twice that we know of. He targets wealthy married women, convinces them to leave their husbands and transfer assets to him, and then disappears once he has what he wants. You're not his first victim, and you won't be his last. The color drained completely from Caroline's face as she absorbed this revelation. That's not possible. Michael loves me. He would never. Christopher opened the folder again and withdrew a detailed report on Michael's background, including photographs and documents related to his previous relationships with married women. This is Susan Pemberton, divorced her husband 2 years ago and moved to Spain with Michael. He left her 6 months later after she had transferred most of her settlement money to accounts he controlled. This is Jennifer Walsh, same pattern, same outcome. The private investigator found 3 other women who had similar experiences with your Michael. Caroline sank onto the edge of the bed, the reality of her situation finally becoming clear. The passionate love affair that had sustained her for years and given her the courage to plan a new life was revealed to be nothing more than an elaborate fraud. The man she had been willing to sacrifice everything for was a predator who had been systematically manipulating her for his own gain. How long have you known? Caroline asked quietly, her defiance replaced by exhaustion and despair. 3 weeks, Christopher replied. I found your secret room by accident, read your letters, your journal, everything. I've been watching you lie to me every single day since then, watching you plan to steal from me and disappear with a man who was planning to rob you blind. Caroline looked up at Christopher with tears in her eyes, and, for a moment, she looked like the young woman he had fallen in love with 40 years earlier. What happens now? Christopher had prepared for this moment, but actually facing his wife's defeat and understanding gave him no satisfaction. That depends on you, Caroline. You can cancel your trip to France, end your relationship with Michael, and we can begin divorce proceedings in an orderly, legal manner. We'll divide our assets fairly, and you'll be able to start over with your dignity and your freedom intact. And if I refuse? Then, I'll have you arrested for theft before you reach the airport, Christopher said quietly. I'll pursue criminal charges, civil litigation, and I'll make sure that Michael Thornton faces prosecution for fraud. You'll lose everything, Caroline, and you'll likely face prison time. Caroline sat in silence for several long minutes, processing the complete collapse of everything she had believed about her future. Finally, she looked up at Christopher with an expression that contained equal parts sorrow and resignation. I'll call off the trip, she said quietly. I'll end things with Michael. But, Christopher, our marriage is over. Even if I stay and we go through a proper divorce, what we had together died long before I met Michael. We've both been living a lie for years. Christopher nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and profound sadness. I know, he said. I understand that now. Maybe we both deserve a chance to find something real, something honest. But let's end this with dignity, Caroline. Let's not destroy each other in the process. As Caroline began unpacking her suitcase and Christopher prepared to call the car service to cancel her airport pickup, both of them understood that they were witnessing the end of not just their marriage, but of the people they had been within that marriage. The next months would bring lawyers, negotiations, and the practical work of untangling 37 years of shared life. But the relationship that had sustained them through 4 decades, for better and worse, was already over. The secret room would be sealed, the letters destroyed, and the house that had held so many memories would be sold. Christopher and Caroline would begin new lives, separately, carrying with them the hard-won knowledge that love without honesty is merely performance, and that the most devastating betrayals are often committed by those we trust most completely.